So dealing damage in Titan Quest is the same as dealing damage in any other game, but of course it's got its own intricacies. If you're only interested in the Ragnarok specific stuff, like the new elemental damage conversion and how its mechanics work, then you can check the comments at the bottom. I have timestamps for all the individual topics. There's two main things to talk about when talking about dealing damage, and that's your damage sources, first, where your damage comes from, and second, your damage scaling. So, how do you make that damage better? And to talk about these things, we're going to be on my Dragon Hunter here. She's a well accomplished hero. She's done with Legendary, she's got everything she needs, and she's been my punching bag throughout all of this expansion, testing mechanics and whatnot. So, we're going to go over things on this character as I kind of talk about them. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is the number one thing, your damage sources. So what are the different types of damage? Where do they come from? First of all, let's look at some skills, because there's a difference between dealing damage with a weapon and dealing damage with a skill, like these landmines here. So you have to kind of get used to reading tooltips, but either you're dealing damage with just your weapon, you're dealing damage with just a spell, like a skill that doesn't involve your weapon, or you're doing both. Take a look at something like Runeward Explode here. This has a 4% chance to be used upon a weapon strike, and the telltale sign that this is attached to a weapon is that it has a chance to be used. That's on the tooltip. So a chance to be used from what? A good guess would be the weapon. The arc of attack, just so you know, is another telltale sign with Titan Quest tooltips. So either this happens in a projectile, in which case the radius occurs, 2.5 meters, or if you're using it in melee, it attacks in this 120 degree arc when it procs. And by the way, we use the term proc, and I'm going to continue using that. It just means programmable random occurrence. That's where it came from. It's debatable. It doesn't matter. So when I attack with a weapon and this thing procs, not only is that enemy that gets hit with Runeward Explode initially going to take the weapon hit, but he's also going to take all of this listed effects as well. So the 8 damage, the 8 fire damage, the stun, but also this radius occurs. And when this radius occurs, everyone who's around that creature is going to take all of these listed effects as well, and they're going to each take a strike from my weapon. That's something that you wouldn't intuit, but that's what happens with these sort of nuancical tooltips. You have to read them closely, and just know if it's a skill that also is tied to a weapon attack, you're going to get both the listed effects on the tooltip as well as the weapon strike. You contrast that to something like Seal of Fate or Runic Mines, which we were talking about earlier. There's nothing on this tooltip that indicates that it uses your weapon at all. And of course, once you take it into the practical world, you cast it, and you could see my character's not doing anything. She just kind of lifts her hands in the air, and all of a sudden there's mines. There's no weapon attached to this skill whatsoever. Couple other than Seal Fate is just like Runic Mines in that it doesn't use your weapon. Volley up here, chance to be used, so that's attached to my weapon. So when I hit a creature, there's an 18% chance that in addition to getting hit by my weapon, the listed effects will occur. In this case, I launch 3 more projectiles. And you'll get used to that based on your character and your own testing of abilities and stuff like that. So I'm going to throw up a chart on the screen now. So once you've learned to read your tooltips, you've probably noticed that there's different damage schools tied to those abilities and also tied to your weapons. And you have to kind of, when planning your build, take into account of these things, because certain attributes govern certain damage types, certain damage schools. So this chart just shows which ones they are. I mean, you can also read that on the tooltips if you hover over Strength, Intelligence, Dexterity. The only 2 honorable mentions, I think, if you're listening, is Intelligence. It just says elemental damage. Well, ever since Anniversary, Intelligence has also governed, as in scaled, the damage over time components of Fire, which is Burn, Lightning, which is Electroburn, and Frost, which is Frostburn. Before, it didn't used to scale those. Just notice that now it does. So if you have a character planned who's going to deal a lot of Electroburn damage, like a Prophet or something like that, just know that you still kind of want Intelligence. And that's going to make a difference, because attributes in this game are very, very tight. You have to spend each one carefully. There's a lot of high requirements for weapons and armors. But at the same time, you also want to scale your damage correctly, which of course we'll talk about again later. The other honorable mention is flat life leech. So if I were to open my inventory, you can see I've got this weapon. It's got the rapacious prefix. That adds flat life leech. It's read as 96 life leech over 3 seconds. That's not governed by anything particularly since Anniversary Edition. I suspect that that's been stripped away from Vitality. I haven't confirmed that, but just know that they added in Anniversary Edition scaling per level up. So every time your character levels up, they get 2.5% life leech and also added 2.5% energy leech as scaling for this effect. So it's not governed by any attribute necessarily, just the level of your character. So let's go through each of these effects one by one. We'll talk about their strengths. Each one of them has their own strengths and weaknesses. So aptly, we'll start with strength. This is a powerful damage type. It's also one of the unique ones. First, anytime you see just damage, if you see something that says 5 to 10 damage, that implies physical damage, which includes skills like Runeward Burn. Where was that? I'm sorry, Runeward Explode. This 8 damage, that means physical damage. The thing about physical damage is it's affected by armor. So that, includes enemies too. So you're up against your enemy's armor when you're dealing physical damage, but luckily the physical resistance on enemies is pretty low. So if you want to get a lot out of your physical damage, you're going to have to reduce their armor. At the very least, you're going to have to find a way to contend with their armor. In this game, unlike Grim Dawn, you can only crit with melee attacks. You cannot crit with ranged attacks. You cannot crit with spells. So the offensive ability versus defensive ability equation does not affect those at all. It just affects melee for physical and pierce. And being able to crit is a very powerful thing just because opportunities to scale your damage multiplicatively, as in outside the parentheses, so end of calculation multiplication, that sort of opportunity doesn't exist very much in Titan Quest. There's not a whole lot of effects that do that. Crit is one of the very, very few. The other thing to note, and this is kind of a weakness, is that a lot of enemy types are very resistant to physical damage. If you look at a ghost, anything tagged as a ghost, like Alistair, the boss in the Acropolis, they will resist, actually not even resist, they will absorb 60% of all physical damage. That takes all of your physical damage, multiplies it by 0.4. The thing about damage absorption is you can't reduce that. There's no way to get rid of it, unlike resistances, which you can reduce. So that's pretty powerful, and you'll find that ghosts are a little bit less susceptible to your damage. Pierce damage, then. We'll talk about all of dexterity, I suppose, but starting with pierce, this is another form of instantaneous damage. It's not damage over time. This is not affected by armor, unlike physical damage. Physical damage, of course, is affected by armor. It works the same way against enemies as it does against you. So you can look up my defensive guide if you want to know exactly how armor works. But pierce is not affected by armor at all, it just bypasses armor. Now that's touted as kind of a unique thing, but it's really not. It's just like elemental damage in that regard. You compare the damage you deal to the enemy's pierce resistance, and enemies tend to have pretty high pierce resistance, at least higher on average than physical. Of course, that doesn't mean it's bad, but just note that undead tend to have pierce resist like skeletons, and there's a lot of skeletons in this game. But it's in no way a bad effect. Of course, dexterity also governs bleed and poison damage. Both of these things are pretty popular. I've noticed a lot of people like to play with bleed characters. A lot of people want to make brigands and use bows and launch poison bombs and things like that. The only caution I would give, and I always give this caution, is that there is a lot of resistance towards bleeding damage, and it's even worse for poison damage. There is extremely high damage absorption all over the place for poison damage. So if you look at a construct or a device or an undead, all of those creature types have at least 80% damage absorption against poison. And of course, we talked about how bad damage absorption is. So there's no real way to improve your damage there. Of course, you can reduce the resists of the last 20% that's not being absorbed, and you can do more damage that way. Just note that there's a lot of highly, highly immune enemies. It's kind of like Diablo 2. If you played Diablo 2, you probably noticed in Hell mode, that you really can't kill some enemies. If you're like a frost sorcerer and you've got your blizzard or your frost orb, you're going to run into something that's like frost immune, and all of a sudden you just straight up can't fight it. It's a little bit like that, just not as bad. That said, the nice thing about bleed and pierce is sometimes you can find ridiculous base damages. I'll show off one item I found a little bit later on. But I mean, the higher you can get your bleed base, the more just asinine crazy you can scale it. And lastly, we'll talk about the intellect scaling things. That's elemental damage and vitality damage. So elemental damage, I think, is the most complex. That will be illuminated a little bit later. The bonuses in particular, it's hard to see what applies to what, because you can, of course, find scalars to just cold damage, to just frostburn damage. You can find scalars to all elemental damage. It's a bit confusing as to what applies to what. But when you see elemental damage anywhere, just know it's fire, cold, and frost damage. The most nuancical thing is if you find it in flat form, so if you have a weapon that comes with added 13 to 22 elemental damage on it or something like that. Or if in my case you saw that Seal of Fate, it just has a bunch of elemental damage on it. That's going to be 1/3 fire, 1/3 frost, and 1/3 lightning. So if you had 100 flat elemental damage somewhere tied to a skill, then it's going to be 33 fire damage, 33 frost damage, 33 lightning damage. And just like we said about D2, in Diablo 2, it was nice to have damage that's spread around a little bit. That way you can counter these things, right? You want to have Frost Orb, but you also want to have Hydras, just in case you can deal with those frost immune enemies. So elemental damage is uniquely cool because it does all 3 damage types. So if you run into a heavy resist, you're not going to get all of your damage neutered, just a third of it. We'll talk about the intricacies of what scalars on items affect what particular types. Is it just cold? Is it all cold? How does that work? We'll talk about that later. For now, the last thing I want to mention is vitality damage, the last thing governed by intelligence. Of course, it governs vitality damage. Vitality damage, just like elemental and pierce, they go up against your enemy's resists. It's not heavily resisted, and by the way, elements typically aren't either. You'll run into some very obvious enemies like a frost spirit. Guess what? He's kind of resistant to frost. That should be obvious. But the other thing about vitality is it also governs another damage type, which is not so obvious. It's the percent reduction to enemy's health. So if you have on your weapon or something like, I don't know, do I have it on one of my weapons? Let me check. So we're back in the game now. Touch of Nyx has just, gosh, like a huge list of things. And it doesn't appear to be on here. Did I come prepared? I did not. Look at me once again. Anyway, you'll find that effect pretty frequently throughout your entire play experience. Just note that that's scaled with vitality damage. Or more so, it's resisted by vitality resist. And that's important to note because you can reduce an enemy's vitality resist, and if you do that, they're more susceptible to that effect. So in planning your build then, we've talked about tooltips, so when you're reading the different masteries, what the synergies are, you can probably figure that out better if you know if you're attacking with a weapon versus just using a spell. We've also talked about the attributes and how they govern different schools of damage, so you can plan out your attributes a little bit better. And of course, we talked about how those schools of damage line up and what their strengths and weaknesses are. The last thing we need to talk about in damage sources is damage conversion. This game doesn't have too in-depth of a damage conversion types. I mean, it's not Path of Exile. All we have is conversion from physical to pierce, and conversion from physical to elemental, which is brand new to Ragnarok. And if you've clicked the timestamp, this is probably that part that should be very interesting to you. Now, I've done a ton of testing with converting. I've kind of obsessed over this topic because when I first looked at it, when I first looked at the Rune Master, I was looking at transmutation, actually. And it just, to me, looked insane. I mean, you can fully convert all of your weapons base damage to elemental. I mean, can you convert skill damage? Can you convert all of your weapon damage? How about added flat damage? Can you convert battle rage, crushing blow? When you get these things critting, it's going to be insane. Well, as it turns out, there are some nuances when it comes to converting in this game, and we're going to talk about Elemental first, since that's the one that's the most interesting with Ragnarok, since it's brand new. So first I should, I guess, describe my test bench, because of course I've been testing this thing. You'll notice when I attack this target dummy, there's a bunch of numbers there. Well, that's not normal. I just told you that range damage can't crit. And of course there is this display critical damage feature, but it doesn't display anything but crits. Well, I use that old trick. There's a trick to download a hex editor and change some stuff. I'm not a code guy. I just monkey see what monkey do. But I use this for testing purposes, and we're going to notice one thing real quick, and that's if I get rid of all of my flat damage. Let's see, how do I do that? Let's equip a dagger, and we'll equip all my plus skills gear and some intelligence gear just so I can actually use that stuff. Is this good enough? So if I look at my skills, I'm plus 4, so I have 99% weapon-based damage to elemental, and I'm getting the other 1% from this Aether charm. So now I'm fully converted to elemental. So real quick, if I attack this target dummy, you're going to notice that there's no damage being displayed. Alright, so in no way can Titan Quest display elemental damage, either as critical damage or otherwise. Just keep that in mind, because it'll be important to what I have to say about elemental. So first, let's talk about what can and cannot be converted. So if we go over a weapon, let's say this mace, not only does it have the weapon's base damage, and when you read this tooltip for transmutation, it says weapon-based damage becomes elemental. Again, the trend of reading tooltips closely is a very important thing. So there's a difference between 2 to 7 bonus damage and 5 to 10 damage. So notice that the 2 to 7 has that extra word on it, bonus. Both of these are physical added damage, but bonus damage applies directly to your weapon damage. So this cleaver, for instance, it's going to do 17 to 33, I did the math, damage plus 5 to 10 damage. Right, that's how it works. It's not 15 to 26 plus 7 to 17. It's 17 to 33 plus 5 to 10. That's going to make a difference, because I'm going to tell you right now that you can only convert bonus damage. You cannot convert added, just flat regular damage. So I can prove that right now. So we'll equip this mace that just has bonus damage. If we attack this target dummy, it's not displaying anything. Everything is elemental damage. But right when we equip this cleaver, which has both, all of a sudden we're doing a slight amount of damage, and it's a little bit more than what it should be. That's because my physical damage is being scaled through my strength. So it's higher than you're seeing, but this is just from my pen claw. So what about added damage from rings, amulets, other pieces of gear? Well, I have this Ardroit loop. If I replace one of my rings with that, I can no longer use my gear, apparently. Let's see, I should have something to fix that. Yes, I do, I have a necklace. There we go. So now I have this added flat damage from a ring. And what happens? We're getting higher numbers. That means we have more and more non-elemental damage, which means it does not convert. So only bonus damage tied to your weapon can convert. No other flat damage on your gear can convert to elemental, unfortunately. However, shields, if you have a shield, for instance, this Ash Crude Buckler, you can see that it does 13 damage. That damage happens, by the way, if you use something like Batter from the defense line, or any of those 3 shield procs on the right side of the defense tree. Those are going to create an attack with your main hand weapon, as well as attack with your shield, as well as do the listed effects on the tooltip for the proc. The damage on your shield does convert. Shields are counted as weapons. So just note that when you're using a proc like that on the defense tree, the shield's damage will convert, however, the skill damage will not. No skill damage can convert to elemental if it was pierce or physical already. So in my case, if I go to Runeward Explode again, this does 8 damage and 8 fire damage. I cannot convert that 8 damage to elemental. Again, that's because transmutation converts your weapon's base damage. It does not say anything about skills. And I've tested this too, so don't worry about that. In fact, If I put one into here, it's a proc, so it's not going to happen all the time. There it is, that 138 right there. That was Runeward Explode, so there's the proof. And that's kind of unfortunate because the very first thing I wanted to do with a Rune Master was combine it with Warfare and convert Battle Rage, Banner, and Crushing Blow to elemental damage. I think that would be insane. But unfortunately, you can't. Now, the last thing, and this is probably the thing I was most curious about, and I've tested this rigorously as well, is can elemental damage crit? Well, you've probably read the writing through the walls by now. No, you cannot crit with elemental damage. Now, I have about 80% certainty on this based on my own testing. And the testing is a combination of past assumptions from long ago testing that added damage on a weapon could not crit if it were elemental. You would think that with all the changes they did with Ragnarok that they would have changed that, because of course you can convert all this damage. We have offensive ability on Runeward Feather, so why would that even exist if you couldn't crit with elemental, which seems to be the theme of the build. Either it was an oversight, or it's not working properly, or I'm wrong. And I bring this up because, that 20% uncertainty that I have, could be swayed, but if someone does some clever testing, maybe someone has better tools than I do for testing these things, or we can get some dev knowledge illuminated. I would love to hear it. I would love to be proven wrong if indeed I am wrong. But I'm going to tell you based off of my hours of testing this very thing that you cannot crit with elemental damage. And I've tested this in a number of ways. One example of that is combining Rune Mastery with Warfare, getting a ton of offensive ability, so I guarantee every single one of my attacks is a crit. Like I got thousands of OA, and I was level 40. Well, like 1500 OA. And then I set up 2 test benches. One is where I used Onslaught, no conversion, and I reduced my enemy's armor without adding any extra damage. I made the test bench as clean as possible. My strength was scaled just as well as my intellect, so when I went to test the converted damage, it shouldn't have an impact. I reduced armor from the equation. I didn't want to skew towards elemental because elemental's not affected by armor. And I simply counted how many attacks it took to kill an enemy, and I tried it on multiple enemies. I took an average, and then I converted my damage, and did the same exact thing. And this was after the patch that they made the damage conversion always active as long as you have it. And again, I re-attacked those enemies, the same enemies. I counted again, took an average, and my data found that the physical damage, so when I wasn't converted, I killed quicker. And I took that to mean that the added damage I got from the critical hits was making up the difference. Or in other words, my physical damage was critting, but the converted damage was not critting, and so it did less damage with that build. And the last thing to know about elemental conversion, and this is dev knowledge, it was confirmed by developer, and I think in the Steam forums, all of the bonuses add together, they cap at 100%, and they happen before pierce conversion. So, the adding together thing, I'm adding the 99% from transmutation with my Aether Charm, which is right here. So it adds the 99 to the 20. So I'm over converting. However, I'm not getting any extra benefit from the other 19% that I'm getting out of this. It doesn't change my sheet damage at all if I got rid of it. And in fact, getting rid of this ring, it shows that it does, but that's because of the flat damage more than anything else. Just trust me on that. You're not going to get any extra benefit from overcapping your elemental conversion. It used to be bugged, but they fixed it as of this video with the last patch that came out. And that last note I said, elemental conversion happens before pierce conversion. Pierce conversion in this game is called pierce ratio, by the way. That's the only way of converting to pierce, and we'll talk about that next. But that's important because if you've converted all of your weapon's damage to elemental already, there's nothing left for your pierce ratio to convert. And pierce ratio works the same way, by the way. It doesn't add more pierce damage on top of your 99 to 105 in this case. It just takes 10% of that 99 to 105 and converts it to pierce damage. That happens to be bad if you're scaling physical. You want all of that damage to be physical damage because you're going to get more scalars out of it. You have more strength. You're going to be able to scale that damage better. So you're losing damage, actually. by having it converted to pierce. Of course, you can look at it the other way and say, well, you want to split your damage like Diablo 2. Well, that's less important, I think, for physical. You can just reduce your enemy's armor, and there's no physical immune mobs in this game, and ghosts are pretty rare. In general, you don't want your pierce ratio to impact your damage. Well, that's kind of a nice thing about elemental damage transmutation then, because if you've converted all your weapons damage, none of it converts to pierce. That means you can scale all of your weapons damage then with intelligence and all your other elemental scalars and stuff like that, and you don't lose any damage with the pierce ratio. Now, where this little rule can lead you astray, this whole thing where you convert elemental before pierce, is if you're trying to build something like a rogue/rune, and you're going to have a weapon with a lot of pierce ratio on it, and you're going to have blade honing to increase your pierce ratio, and then you pick up transmutation as well. Well, just note that, let's say if you do 100 damage, just 100 damage on your weapon, and you have 50% elemental conversion, and let's say a base 50% pierce ratio, the end result isn't going to be 50 elemental damage and 50 pierce damage. Remember that the elemental converts first. That means it's going to convert that first 100, it's going to be 50 elemental and 50 physical, and then the pierce ratio is going to be able to convert the rest. So the end result's going to be 50 elemental, 25 physical, and 25 pierce. So when you're combining them both, just note that these conversions have an anti-synergy when combined with one another, and it particularly disfavors the pierce conversion because it happens afterwards. Just keep that in mind. So let's talk about pierce ratio then. It's the last form of conversion. It's existed as long as the game has existed, and it exists in Grim Dawn as well. Grim Dawn also has, I believe, ways to convert other types of damage to pierce in the conventional way as well. It's a little bit hard to understand pierce ratio, which is why I'll go over it right now. I mentioned that elemental damage, the bonuses add together. Well, in this case, we have, if you look at this iron knife, a 15% pierce ratio. So if you got blade honing on your rogue, for example, and let's just say your blade honing increased your pierce ratio by 50%. You're not going to get the 15 here plus 50 for a total of 65% pierce ratio. All of the increased pierce ratio modifiers that you find, including from blade honing, but from anywhere else as well, and Ragnarok, I think, added some really cool pieces of gear that have increased pierce ratio on them. Those things don't add together, they instead multiply with the base. Ugh, what does that mean? Well, if you have an iron knife with something as low as 15% pierce ratio, actually, I kind of want to make the math easier. I don't need that. Okay. So let's just say you have 50% increased pierce ratio on your blade honing. The end result's not 65. It's going to be 22.5. I did that right? I hope so. Anyway, it's going to be bad, right? So increasing your pierce ratio is better if your base pierce ratio is already higher. And you can probably start to see that it's very hard to fully convert your damage to pierce. I mean, it's incredibly hard. You would need something like a base 50% pierce ratio, which might exist on some spears, maybe. Spears and bows have a high pierce ratio, but blade honing does not affect bows. So let's just assume it's a spear. 50% base pierce ratio. You'd need 100% increased pierce ratio combined in order to get this thing to 100% or full conversion. And the individual, affixes that increase your pierce ratio, those will add together. But once you add all of those bonuses together, you then have to multiply those bonuses with the base. So you'd need a base 50% plus 100 increased pierce ratio in total. That's very, very hard to achieve. Incidentally, that makes certain items introduced with Ragnarok very, very interesting. So take a look at this thing. This thing is an Ichthian Stinger. And it has a 20% chance of increasing your pierce ratio by, let's just say, 200%. That's not what it says on this stinger. We'll talk about that in a second. So if we do the math just like we did, we can see that the idea behind this bow is that with its 33% base pierce ratio, we have a 20% chance of making that 100. So in other words, there's a 20% chance per attack that we're going to get full pierce instead of physical damage. Very, very cool bow. but it's itemized kind of oddly. In this particular instance, it says 20% chance of 222 increased pierce ratio. Now, this is leaving me to wonder whether you can overcap your pierce conversion. We just talked about how in Elemental you can't do that. They took that out with the last patch. But you've never really been able to, feasibly convert all of your damage to pierce, so I don't really know, and I've never tested whether you can overcap your conversion. And by that I mean, if you have more than 100% conversion, do you get the extra damage? This thing is going to go above 100. It's going to be like 108% or something like that. The base pierce ratio will be 108 when this procs. Do I get that extra 8% damage on top of my original damage? I don't know. I really don't. It's very hard to test. I would need 3 instances of this particular stinger. One of them would have to have 200, and one of them would have to have a little less than 200. That way I can see if the sheet damage was affected or not. And then from there, I could use the sheet damage to see if it does in fact overcap. Anyway, it's a very interesting item, so if you happen to know the answer to that question, just put it in the comments, just so other people in the future can read that or test it for themselves. So we finished talking about damage sources. Now let's talk about scaling. Scaling is how you take your base damage and really catapult it. You're going to need to scale your damage to be able to contend with legendary difficulty, for instance. It's not enough just to rely on the base damage of your weapons and your skills. So there's a lot of types of increased scaling, percentage-based increased scaling in this game. I'm going to throw up a chart that shows exactly what governs what. It can be very complex at times to be able to tell, does this affix actually increase my damage? I'm not going to describe each one of them orally. I'll just instead leave this chart up. But I will talk about percent total damage. That's a pretty rare affix, but total damage just takes all damage types. It governs all of your damage, whether that's physical or elemental or vitality or whatever, and it increases it by that percentage. It does not multiply the damage, and it would be better, incidentally, if it did. It's just a straight damage scaler. You'd treat it just like elemental damage, or you'd treat it like percent vitality damage, or you'd treat it like percent physical damage, any one of those. Next is crit. Now, I've already talked about how critical damage is a damage multiplier, one of those outside of the parentheses sort of things. And it is very useful for scaling your damage. The way it works, and again, it only applies to melee, physical, or piercing attacks in this game. It does not apply to anything else. Is it compares your offensive ability, which is shown on your second page here. You get 1 point of OA for every dexterity. The rest of it will probably come from your mastery, like Warfare Mastery has a ton of it. But the more offensive ability you have, eclipsing your enemy's defensive ability, the harder you're going to quit, the higher that multiplier is for critical hits. And so you want to have a lot of OA if you want to scale your damage that way, and you will, incidentally, as a Conqueror or any other Warfare character. And it's tremendously useful and all that stuff, but just note that if your OA is low, like let's say it's lower than your enemy's defensive ability, just like what happens to you, they're going to start, I would call it a glancing blow. I don't think that's the technical word for it, but you do less damage. So it works the opposite way too. There isn't any gear that gives like percent increased critical strikes or anything like that, like you'd see in another RPG. Crit works just strictly off of OA versus DA, and you can read about the breakpoints and the exact thresholds and the math and the formulas. If you type in Titan Quest mechanics in Google, it'll take you to well-written guides from Steam and also from Kirmizi Perfect and other things. They'll give you the formulas. Another great way of scaling your damage, and this also works as a damage multiplier, is reducing your enemy's resistance. Now, just like we talked about in the defensive guide, if I have, what's a good example? 20% pierce resistance, I'm going to take my enemy's pierce damage by that time in the damage order, and I'm going to multiply it by 0.8. So it's just straight multiplication, outside the parentheses, all good stuff. That means if I can lower my enemy's pierce resistance, that would be even better, right? If I can reduce my enemy's pierce resistance by, let's say, 20, then all of a sudden they're taking, at that point in the damage order again, 20% more damage. So it's a multiplier. Of course, if you read more damage in PoE, then you'll know that's a multiplier as well. Just let it suffice to say that reducing your enemy's resistances is a very, very, very good way of scaling your damage, and it kind of solves that issue of fighting fire pixies with fire, right? You can do that as long as you can reduce your enemy's resist. However, you'll probably also note that we talked about damage absorption, like if you're trying to poison a construct, like that doesn't happen, right? If your king is like some sort of golem, you don't just slip poison in his drink. I don't know why he's drinking or why your king's a golem, but it just doesn't work that way, right? And that makes sense. You can't reduce damage absorption. You have to just deal with it. You can only reduce resists. But most things have resists. It's only a few things that have damage absorption. So in general, this is very powerful. So when planning your build, I mean, the way I always plan builds personally is I look for as many damage resistance types as I possibly can. There are 3 types of reduced resistances, and it's you can tell by their language. It's kind of nuanced. I don't know why it did this way. They all work mechanically different. And if you're aware of the Grim Dawn chart, it works exactly like that. I mean, 100% exactly like Grim Dawn. And if you're not aware of the Grim Dawn chart, I'm going to put it on screen. So, props to the author. Hopefully, I'll remember to include his name on screen too. I don't remember it offhand. But anyway, you can see on Aftershock here, the language is 14 reduced resistances for 4 seconds. So that is an absolute form of resist reduction. It's going to reduce my enemy's resist by 14%. It's just going to subtract that from wherever they are, all of the resists in this case. It doesn't say anyone in particular, therefore it's all of them. And it's going to be able to take them below 0. However, these don't stack. This particular verbiage does not stack. It just takes whatever the largest one you have anywhere on your gear. So if I had Aftershock and a weapon like Sapros that also shares this language, it would take whatever the larger amount is. 14 compared to Sapros, it would probably be Sapros. Therefore, if I was using Sapros and Aftershock, I would not get any of that particular benefit from Aftershock because Sapros is better. Now, if I compare that to Hunting Master, I have Flush Out. I'm an elemental build, so I wanted to reduce my enemy's elemental resists. First thing to note is that this language, minus X% Y resistance, this type of verbiage stacks with Aftershock's verbiage. It just happens to do that. Again, you can consult the chart for this sort of thing. But this is the best form because it's absolute in that it subtracts from whatever my enemy's resists currently are, elemental, and it can take them below 0, just like the other verbiage. However, this one, these bonuses stack with one another. So if I happen to have another form of this verbiage, and I think Plague in the nature tree has this verbiage, it's offhand, so I'm not exactly sure. But those would stack with one another, and that's enormously powerful. This is the best version because of that. The verbiage I don't have anywhere on this build, but if you're using Storm Mastery, it's the version on Squall. Now, that's the worst type, unfortunately, for Squall. I mean, Squall is amazing, so that's fine. But just note that whatever that verbiage is, and again, I don't have it offhand, it doesn't reduce your resists. The enemy resists absolutely, with, in other words, with addition or subtraction. It multiplies. That means if they had 10% resist and you use Squall, and Squall's magnitude was 50, then it would reduce them to 5 from 10. So that's not a huge difference, right? That's kind of lackluster. You would rather reduce that resistance into the negatives absolutely, which is what the other two do. So just note that there's a distinction between those 3 verbiage types, and Squall is the worst one. There's others like Squall too in this game. Now you can probably tell that stacking all these things together, all these modifiers and multipliers inside and outside parentheses, despite how the math works, you can intuit, and this is where I'm going to get beyond the theory and into the practical, that the more of these things you can combine into your build, the more damage you're going to get. Now, I recommend a Conqueror just in general, and if you've ever played Warfare/Defense before, you have scaling through just straight strength. Of course, a conqueror is going to be a strength-based character, so with your strength, you're going to get a certain percentage of physical damage out of that. You're going to get maybe some on your gear and tied to your skills as well. But you're also going to have crit. Of course, it's a melee build. It's a physical build. Melee physical damage can crit. That's a multiplier. So you have some in parentheses stuff. You have some outside parentheses stuff. And you can also reduce resist if you have battle marker. There's an upgrade to battle marker called Triumph, I believe, and that will reduce enemy resist. So now you have crit, you have a resist reduction, and you have, just regular scaling. Well, that build also benefits from being a weapons-based build. So if I switch this character's gear back to her regular setup, and let's see if I can actually do this without screwing it up. And we'll go back here. That's probably right. You'll notice when I'm attacking, a lot of things are going on. I have my Rune Word Explode proccing. The Black Mist is from my Touch of Nyx. Anytime there's multiple projectiles, that's my volley. So what I'm going to say is that this sort of thing is very beneficial. The example I like to use is Neverwinter Nights. People, when we used to play that game, would talk about this whole low magic versus high magic thing. And all it meant is that in a low magic, which we considered the normal campaign in Neverwinter Nights 2, there wasn't a whole lot of ways to scale your character. Your tools were basic. You couldn't over enchant your gear and get all this ridiculous stuff. You didn't have access to epic levels with all this increasing power creep sort of tools available to you. So you had to make do with what you had, and it was all pretty basic. And in that situation, your best bet for increasing your damage was a combination of attack speed. So you want as much attack speed as you can get, or in Neverwinter Nights 2, that was attacks per second or attacks per round or whatever. You want high flat damage. In Neverwinter Nights 2, that was added to your weapon with, just some basic enchants. In Titan Quest, that would be flat damage, of course, added to your weapon, or with enchants like Aider. If I could afford to put an Aider in this build, I would love to. Or from Primal Magma, I'm using Primal Magma. And you combine those with procs. We talked about procs, so as many procs as you can get. 4 to 5 is probably the maximum. Titan Quest doesn't necessarily have the weapon pool skill system that Grim Dawn has, so I don't know how it deals with conflicts. If your volley proc happens at the same time as your Rune Word Explode, how does the game resolve that? I don't exactly know how that works. But I would say from my own experience that having 3-4 procs, no problem. They're not going to interfere with each other very much. You're better off getting more procs than just having one, like Pulverize in defense and leaving it there, or just volley. So you want to get as many procs as you can get. So you combine your attack speed with flat damage, so that flat damage is applying more frequently, with procs. And because you have high attack speed, your procs per minute, or however you want to quantify that, will be increased. You're going to get more Rune Word Explodes. You're going to get more volleys than if you were attacking very slowly. So you can see with this character, the first thing I did was got high attack speed. That was my ultimate priority. I got very fast weapons for a long time. Eventually I overcapped my attack speed and I was able to switch to slower weapons, in this case fast instead of very fast. And that way I could get the maximum use out of my procs, I can get the maximum use out of my flat damage, and that was good enough. So to go back to the Neverwinter Nights 2 example, Titan Quest is very much like the original campaign in that game. It's a low magic game. You're not going to scale your damage into the millions. It's not PoE. That's going to impact a lot of things. Not only your damage, but also your attack damage converted to health. Life recovery based on that effect has been impacted by that. But also because damage scaling is pretty low altogether, there's not a whole lot of tools, you're going to get a lot of mileage out of weapons-based builds because they're the only ones that can really take use of this trifecta, this whole attack speed, procs, and flat damage thing. Unfortunately, flat damage found on Primal Magma here does not apply to spells. It only does in special circumstances. We'll talk about those skills later. So the only way to scale spell damage, like these mines, is the conventional, multipliers, not through crit, because of course they can't crit, but through reduced res is the best way. That's a multiplier, like I said. But also through increasing your scaling based on that chart I showed you earlier. And you're going to rely on having high base damages in order to do that. If you don't have a high base damage, there's no way spells will ever compete with melee, because of course I can just keep attacking with melee and getting all these free procs and stuff like that. But a lot of spells in this game are tied to cooldowns. I would say practically that's unfortunate because it makes spellcasting a little bit difficult. Spellcasters are very powerful, so, don't get me wrong. But a lot of spells, they have these high cooldowns, so if I just wanted to use Seal Fate, it's powerful. You can see the base is 1080. The higher your base, the more effective your scalers are going to become. That should be obvious. So it's a really great spell, but I can only use it every 9 seconds. And of course, percent cast speed exists in this game. It doesn't reduce the cooldown. That's another affix called minus recharge. But what it does do is it takes care of some of the delay when you're trying to cast a spell, like this Freezing Minds. When I raise my hands up, that'll happen quicker. There'll be less of a delay, and that's actually very important, because if you're in a pinch and you're trying to get away from enemies or whatever, and you need to use mines, you don't want to whiff that. A lot of spells are very easy to whiff. So just keep that in mind. You'll see that in practice. Having cast speed is very good, even for skills that have a cooldown associated to them. Of course, cast speed is most useful to spells that don't have a cooldown, like Ice Shards, in which case you can get absurd amount of cast speed and your Ice Shards are just going to go crazy, and it's shotguns and all that glory stuff. But this whole distinction I'm talking about here is that there's more ways to scale your weapon damage because you have that extra trifecta, as well as being able to scale them the same ways you can scale spells, except even more, because if you're a melee, then you happen to be able to crit. But the advantage that spells have is that their base damage is typically higher, so they can make use of the scalers that they have available to them better than if you're using weapons. There are some exceptions to that. Ragnarok actually added some very cool items to the game. The one I wanted to show off was this Gorgon's Edge. Look at the base damage on the poison with this thing. 717 to 1338. That is ludicrous for Titan Quest. That is just ridiculous. And so, as bad as I said poison damage was because of undead existing, you can just skip undead. Really, you shouldn't fight everything on the screen just because it's there. You can easily dodge undead. Zombies are slow, right? This isn't, The Walking Dead. There's no sprinters or anything like that. These zombies are just really, really slow. Just walk by them. For everything else, though, this poison is very lethal, and better yet, you can scale it very nicely. You can reduce your enemy's resistance to poison with like that nature debuff. I think it's called Plague. You can't crit with it, unfortunately, because dots cannot crit. I don't know if I mentioned that before, but even if a melee attack applies the dot cannot crit. And you can't leech from dots either. Damage over time cannot be leeched. However, this is such a high base that doesn't matter. You're going to be able to reduce resistance. You're going to be able to stack poison damage and duration and stuff through the rogue tree and whatnot. So you can create a really cool rogue/nature character, or rogue/hunter, a brigand, in order to make use of this weapon. And that would be a pretty cool build, especially if you use specific skills like Thunder Strike, which just throws out 5 instances of your weapon in the case of a throwing weapon. And we'll talk about this skill later because it's one of those exceptions to the rule. But anyway, you can use weapons like this to sort of bypass the fact that weapons tend to have low bases. You can see my weapon damage, and this thing is a max top tier throwing weapon, 172 to 183. That's very low in comparison to Seal of Fate when this thing's maxed out, 1080 damage. So you can sort of see the strengths of weapons, the weaknesses of weapons. You can see the strengths of spells, the weaknesses of spells. None of them are bad. The devs did a pretty good job with balance. You can take it from me, someone who's been playing this game a long time. I've used most of the skills in the game. I tend to prefer using weapons, but that's more of a playstyle thing. There are many, many examples of successful spellcasting builds. Many of them have minus recharge on them, which caps at 80%, by the way. That was a change with Anniversary Edition. And you can look up many of them on YouTube. Just make sure it's a Ragnarok video, something that was made within the last 2 years. I think mid 2016 was Anniversary Edition, because that's when a lot of the changes to spells were made with the recharge and all that. But you'll be able to get a relative sense of their effectiveness. Anyway, lastly, I wanted to talk about some fun stuff. There's a couple of fun extra topics with offense, the first one being shotguns. So this is kind of a result of Titan Quest being an old game. It's a novelty that shotguns existed. And shotgunning is when you, let's say it's a projectile. You're going to throw out one instance of a projectile. If I can get 1 point in Thunderstrike, I can show you. So with Thunderstrike, you can see all of these projectiles being thrown out. Well, that was one instance of an attack, right? But what shotgunning is if I get close to an enemy and I use Thunderstrike, it got hit with like 3 or 4 of those projectiles at once. That's what shotgunning is. And of course, shotgunning exists with your enemies. Even in modern aRPGs, your character, can get shotgunned by enemy damage. And that exists in Titan Quest, by the way. It's some of the most dangerous stuff you can encounter. But unlike most other games, you can also shotgun, as I demonstrated. And that's enormously powerful. There are certain spells that can really take advantage of this. Turnian Attack in the Spirit Mastery, Ice Shards we mentioned before in the Storm Mastery, Throwing Knives in the Rogue Mastery, and of course, Thundering Strike, newly in the Rune Mastery. And what makes it so good is that it seems like the balance is kind of askew. They really never balanced shotgunning. They always anticipated, I guess, that only a few projectiles would hit. Well, it's pretty easy, as it happens, to hit a giant boss that's as big as your screen with every single projectile. And when you're attacking just random enemies, if your cone is tight enough, like Frost Shards is a good example, all of the Frost Shards kind of come out in this very narrow cone, especially if you have your cursor at the edge of your screen. And you're going to hit anything that's funneling towards you multiple times with multiple projectiles. And with your cast speed, it's just going to be absurd, trust me. So it's fun to use shotgun abilities. I definitely recommend you make at least one Turnian attack-based character, play around with shotguns through Ice Shards and Throwing Knives. Throwing Knives is probably more interesting, just because of the way it works mechanically. So let's talk about some leveling skills then. This is a pretty popular topic. I'd say it's an important one for Titan Quest. It's kind of hard to level up in this game. It's antiquated and old, and I would say they did a worse job of balancing the early masteries with one another. Some masteries are good at leveling, some are awful. So we're going to go over them one by one here with this leveling tree. And I'll tell you what the best way to level is. And the nice thing is, there's a dual mastery system in Titan Quest, right? So if you want to be a Warfare character, you're not locked in to leveling with Warfare. You can start out with Nature first if you want to make a champion, and I recommend that. Warfare is awful for leveling. But we'll go through each of these masteries and I'll tell you what the best stuff is. So Storm, Squall is an amazing skill. It's an amazing leveling skill. The only thing is it's kind of high up on the tree. So you're going to be level 6 or so before you can take advantage of this thing well. But that's no problem. That's very early in the game, and if all you have to endure is 5 levels to get something as great as Squall, that's going to do you well. Plus, you're going to use Squall throughout the entire game. The reduced damage is particularly useful. And it scales, I think, better than Ring of Fire, which we'll talk about next. And it's going to take you probably throughout all of normal mode, conceivably. Of course, as you get higher, you can add more stuff to the mix, but Squall, amazing leveling skill. You're lucky if you have Storm. You're the luckiest, as it happens, if you're leveling as an Earth Master. Ring of Flame is the best early leveling skill in the game, bar none. It's just a pulsing amount of fire damage. The only bad thing about it is it has a high energy cost. If I were to go put 4 in, you can see 11 active energy cost per second. If you plus 4 this thing, it's even worse. And 57 pulsing fire damage in the early game. I mean, considering I only had to go up to 4 tier, you're like level 8 by the time you maximize this thing. That's insane. If all you have to do is chug a few energy pots, this thing is just going to dice up the first 3 acts for you, no problem. Moving down then, Dream. Dream, unfortunately, isn't the greatest. Distortion Wave is good. But what makes it good is being able to put at least 1 point in resonance and at least 1 point in immolation, because both of these things reduce the cooldown, I can show you here, of the base ability by 3 seconds. So if I got Distortion Wave, it's got a 10-second recharge. That's gross. If I got Chaotic Resonance, that reduces it by 3 seconds, so now it's 7 seconds. I guess that's bearable. You know, you can just gather mobs in between using it. But it's not until you get Psionic Immolation that it becomes more or less good to spam. It's got a 4-second recharge. You can weave that in with Phantom Strike and eventually Distort Reality. These are all good skills, but I think the early game, you'd have to kind of tie it up with Psionic Touch, Distortion Wave, Phantom Strike, you know, just getting them as you go up the tree. But what you're really looking for is Distort Reality. I would say this is a very average, mediocre leveling tree. You might want to go with your other pairing to see if there's something better in that tree for the first few levels. Warfare, as I said, is the worst. I don't recommend going Onslaught. I don't recommend beelining dual wield necessarily. I mean, Crosscut's pretty good, I guess. Tumult is way too far up, but I don't think Crosscut is worth going into. I mean, yeah, you attack in a 90-degree arc, but it's 2 targets, I think maybe 3 targets once you upgrade it maximum. That's not so good. No, it remains 2 targets, and it just does bleed damage as the listed effect. I would actually recommend, if you are dead set on leveling as Warfare, that you go with Battle Rage. Battle Rage can at least kill bosses for you. You're not going to have much AoE, but I mean, I really just don't recommend this tree at all. It's a boss killing tree, it's a buffing tree, so it's not something you want to level with. I'd say this is the absolute worst. Maybe tied with Spirit, but no, it's probably the worst. Spirit, also pretty bad. Life Drain has limited usefulness in the early game, mostly with Cascade. I wouldn't put any marbles into this ability at all. Turnian Attack, if you happen to be using a staff character, is amazing, and it's amazing throughout the whole game. But that minus 75% total damage is pretty brutal early on. I would say altogether, though, if you're using a staff, this is going to be mid-tier. You know, it's not until 16 that it's going to be really, really good, I believe. Arcane Lore is the thing that makes it explode, right? And AoE. Yeah, 1.9 meter radius. So it's not great until 16 points, so because of that, and because you need to put points in here to reduce the malice to damage, I would say it's a mid-tier leveling ability. You need a lot of skills for it. But Lich is incidentally okay. If you beeline to Lich, he's not as good as Wolves. So altogether, I'd say this is mid-tier. So far we have 2 top-tier in Storm and Earth, and we have 2 mid-tier in Dream and Spirit, and we have 1 very low-tier in Warfare. Defense, I would also say, is mid-tier. Actually, you know what? I'll put it in low-tier, just in general. Batter is the leveling skill here. And really, you're looking for Rend Armor, which again is a 16-tier thing. But it attacks 3 targets every time you batter. You can put like 8 points in batter, eventually get 1 point in Rend Armor. And just tie this to your left mouse button. You know, that way you batter on command. You can also put it on the right, but it's likely you'll have something else there, like Shield Charge or something. Low tier, there's nothing really here that's going to help you. Not enough AoE. Nature, very good. I've already talked about Wolves. Just buff these things up. They're a tier 1 ability. You can get it at level 2. And you can see you can start summoning 2 Wolves at a certain point. Let me be more careful with that. When was that threshold? It was at 6. Okay, at 7 points you can summon 2 Wolves. And then you can summon 3. You'll need plus skills to summon 3. So get to the 7 threshold as early as possible. That way you can summon 2 Wolves. And then get like 1 point in Maul, 1 point in Survival Instinct. You can get Plague, which is itself a very good leveling skill. Nature, I would say, is top tier as well. Runes, then, I've already mentioned Magical Charge. I would put this in the top tier category personally. It's not as good as Earth or Nature, but it's extremely good. Hunting, definitely towards the bottom. Unfortunately, the only AoE skill in the early game is Puncture Shot Arrows. I don't have a very high opinion of the Marksman line at all. They nerfed Scattershot Arrows in Anniversary Edition. That's beyond the point of this video. But Flat Bleed, just not very good in an AoE, really. And marksmanship itself is only useful single target. You're going to get use out of this thing if you can run faster than the enemies and kind of get them to funnel in towards you in one direction. Then you can maybe pierce them and hit multiple targets, but this isn't even 100% pierce. So this is definitely a low tier leveling ability in terms of damage. I'm going to put an asterisk there because Woodlore and Herbal Remedy are two of the best early defensive skills in the game. So, you know, if I was playing Dragon Hunter, hunting runes, definitely get Magical Charge, but then get Woodlore and Herbal Remedy as soon as possible. And that leaves Rogue. I am not an authority on rogues, it's my least played mastery. I've tried a few ways of leveling a rogue. I don't personally like Poison Gas Bomb, other people do. I would say it's no squall, but it does a lot more damage. Let's take a look at the base damage once it's fully increased. 390 doesn't scale as well as I thought it would. But in the early game, that first tier, that 131 damage, that's a ton of damage for the early game. So if you're like level 5 or whatever, just avoid Undead and use Poison Gas Bomb. That should be a good leveling skill. It's just more dependent on you attacking the right enemies to use correctly. So anyway, that's all the leveling skills. The last things I want to talk about are some unique spells. One of them is right here in the Rogue Mastery. It's Throwing Knives. So Throwing Knives can eventually be casted very frequently. I think, did they change that in Anniversary? I want to say you can spam Throwing Knives now. So there's a 6-second recharge here. Okay, so it goes down to 1.6 if you max it out. I assume once you +4 this that there's no recharge, so you can spam this thing. So you're going to get lots of projectiles. They're going to spam. There's a 10% chance they'll pass through enemies. The reason this is unique is because Throwing Knives can add the flat damage from your artifact, which is the item right here in the bottom left. It can add the flat damage from rings, from your amulet, and any charms or anything like that that's attached to your armor, like your helmet or your torso or whatever. And it can apply it directly to the spell. That's very unique. I said earlier that flat damage does not apply to spells. Well, it happens to for Throwing Knives. Why? I don't know, it's a mystery. They just decided to do that. But you can do some unique things with that. I mean, of course, you can boost the damage with each projectile. These projectiles shotgun, so that's enormously powerful. But you can also put things like flat life leech that you have on rings or your artifact. And you'll also get the flat life leech, so you get some regen, some sustain. That's usually a problem with spellcasters. They're tied to their potion. They have no way of leeching. So Throwing Knives has a unique advantage in that way. I would say it's probably the best shotgunning skill because it also takes advantage of things like Mandrake, since it is considered an attack in whatever that specific way that weapons are also considered an attack. It means effects like Mandrake do affect it. Mandrake is a hugely useful thing. So if you can add to all of these piercing projectiles a chance to let your enemies fumble or get confused, that's a lot of CC. Take it from me, that's an enormous amount of CC. So that's another benefit of a spell like Throwing Knives. Incidentally, what is the other thing? Thunderstrike works the same way. There is one weakness to Throwing Knives, and that's that it can't take flat damage that's tied to your weapon and add it to the skill. So that kind of sucks for Life Leech because the most Life Leech you're going to get is on your weapon by far. You're going to get a lot of flat damage tied to your weapon in a lot of cases. None of that will apply to Throwing Knives. However, Thundering Strike, this ability literally throws your weapon, if it's a throwing weapon, in 5 different directions. Each of those projectiles is an instance of that weapon. So when it hits, you get all of the effects of that weapon and any damage that can add to that weapon's damage. And it affects everyone who's hit, including in a sort of shotgun sense. Of course, any bleeds, they don't stack with one another. Since this is an offense video, I'll give out that tidbit too. Dots from a single source cannot stack with themselves. It's the same thing as Grim Dawn and other aRPGs usually. But dots from different sources can stack on one another. So Runeword Burn, for instance, this burn damage can stack on top of poison damage that I got from Envenom Weapon. So my weapon can both poison and burn. If Runeward Burn also happened to do poison damage, that poison damage would stack from the poison damage from a Venom weapon because they're separate sources. But the bad thing about dots tied to your weapon is they apply over 3 seconds, right? It's 25 over 3. Well, every time you hit, it's just going to reapply this Envenom weapon. It's not going to stack the poison, it's just going to refresh it. That kind of sucks because you're only going to get 1/3 of the effect of this 25 poison damage. It's going to tick like once. It's not going to get its full duration and damage. So that kind of devalues things like toxic distillation. It improves your duration. Hooray, you're just gonna refresh it anyway. It's not gonna add any damage. But sometimes, like with throwing knives, not every knife is going to pierce, and so not every poison is going to be applied or reapplied instantly. So sometimes you can make use of that 3 seconds. But anyway, I've rambled about that stuff enough. That's Thunderstrike and throwing weapons. They're very unique. Turning and attack also is very unique. Turning attack is more of a direct weapon attack that happens to split your weapon in 3 projectiles. It's more like Thunderstrike, I guess, than anything else, except that you can spam it. So those are the 3 highly unique skills that exist in the game. And lastly, of course, since pets are always looked down on, I'll give them a little bit of a shout out here at the very end of the video. Anniversary Edition added a lot of ways to scale pets. Looks like I locked myself into these masteries. Here we go. So there's items that will give you pet bonuses, and it'll clearly say on the item that it applies to pets. Here's what the bonuses are. And you can add flat damage to your pets. You can add total speed, health, resists, all that sort of thing. So your pets are more survivable in the new game than they were if you remember playing in Immortal Throne. And they also deal a lot more damage. Just note that a lot of things that you wouldn't think count as a pet do count as a pet. That includes in the Rogue Mastery, there it is, Lay Trap. Lay Trap just shoots out a lot of projectiles. I think these projectiles eventually pierce. Yes, they do. Each of these projectiles from each of these traps, and you can have 3 of them, will pierce, and they will do added damage equal in magnitude to whatever is on your pieces. They'll take advantage of those pet modifiers just as easily as your Lich would, or that Wolves would, or that your Core Dweller would. Except it's even better with Rogue because you get 3 of them and they're constantly firing off abilities. So you're going to get more applications of that added damage with Lay Trap. Incidentally, if you have Wolves, you have 3 Wolves as opposed to 1 Nymph. 3 Wolves are going to be able to take advantage of those flat modifiers much better because there's 3 of them. It's a parallel process, right? So that's just something to know about pet damage and pet scaling. Wolves and the throwing trap things, the Lay Trap, those are the best damage summons in the game. Lich is great and he's my favorite, but there's only 1 of him. So with Anniversary Edition, they definitely made it so Lay Trap and Summon Wolf are inadvertently the best summons for damage. And just a quick thing on total speed with pets. Pets kind of have a weird thing with their AI trying to get to enemies. If their enemies move, they'll try to correct their pathing, and they'll kind of get confused, and they'll try to stumble over themselves. A lot of that horrible AI sort of thing, and that's with every game. That's not a cheap shot at the devs. But bad pet AI, or just pet AI in general, is countered with total speed. If your pets move faster, they will connect to their enemies quicker, and they'll bypass all of that weird logic. They'll stumble over themselves less. You'll have higher uptime on your damage, so treat total damage with added respect because of that. Treat total speed with added respect because not only will they attack faster, but they'll connect faster too. So anyway, that's the last thing I have to say about pets, and frankly, that's the last thing I have to say about this video. So if you've made it to the end, thank you for listening. Hopefully I brought something to your attention that you didn't know before. That's the whole goal with these videos. If you want to know more, if you want to reach out to me, ask me questions, I'm more than willing to ask questions. In fact, I encourage it. I like talking about video games. I like talking about build ideas, stuff like that. By far the easiest way to get a hold of me is on my Twitch. I live stream. If you go to my Twitch, you can see my schedule. I'm most active there than anywhere else. And you can come by and hang out. You can come by, support me. I appreciate when people talk in the chat. It gives me something to comment on. But I do a lot of course, Titan Questy things. So if I don't see you there, then there'll be more stuff coming out on my YouTube. I've got build guides, campaign guides. Of course, I have a defensive guide video. It's a little bit more classroom-ish. I'm still kind of going over my formats, seeing what works better. If you have a preference over which one you liked better, the format between the defense video and the offense video, let me know. This is a bit more freeform and a little bit more relaxed. And I'm toying with my format, and so while I am impressionable here, it's your chance to give me feedback, and I would appreciate it. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.